What I would like to do today is just briefly give a review of what I've been teaching you, or suggesting, I should say, from the book of Daniel with regard to Antiochus Epiphanes actually being the Antichrist, and coming back and repeating, or continuing, I should say, his persecution of the Jews that he began all the way back in about 168 BC. In Daniel chapter 8, we saw that the account of Antiochus Epiphanes there coming up out of one of the divisions of Alexander's empire when it was broken up, and that when, in fact, it says in chapter 8 of Daniel, it says, and in the latter time of their kingdom, meaning the 4 kingdoms that came out of Alexander's empire, that this person was going to arise. He's called the little horn in Daniel chapter 8 when it's clearly talking about Antiochus, and also in chapter 7 when it's talking about the end times and the 10 horns that come up out of that last kingdom, the Roman Empire. That the little horn comes up there as well, talks about him using the same terminology. We saw that the terminology abomination of desolation is used in Daniel 11 with regard to Antiochus, and we also see that Jesus used the same terminology. What I want to do today is look at a few New Testament passages that I think confirm these things. So let's start by going to Matthew chapter 24. Now, you guys, I'm sure you're well familiar with this chapter. It's referred to as the Olivet Discourse. It was a conversation between Jesus and some of his disciples as they sat on the Mount of Olives. It was on the Tuesday just before Jesus' crucifixion, and his disciples came to him. Let's look at verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and the disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple, and Jesus said to them, "Do you not see these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and betray one another," that is, many of Christ's followers, "and will hate one another, and many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant, and those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulations, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will rise to show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And then Jesus goes on with a series of parables with regard to how his followers should be ready. He talks here about false Christs, pseudo-Christs, plural, false prophets, pseudo-prophets, plural, and the purpose of false Christs and false prophets are for what? To deceive, even if possible, the elect. That is to turn away Christians from Christ and from the hope of his coming. And he warns us here in this chapter about not paying any attention to those false Christs and false prophets and so forth. Now, the interesting thing about this passage of Scripture is that Jesus references the book of Daniel in verse 15. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. And then we have these curious words in brackets. Whoever reads, let him understand. What he means by that is whoever is reading the book of Daniel, let him understand. Now, that implies that at the present time there was not clear understanding, because he's talking about an understanding in the future at the time when the abomination occurs. What's fascinating about this is, of course, these disciples that Jesus was talking to were Jews, of course. They were very familiar with Antiochus Epiphanes. They were familiar with his desecration of the temple, his abomination of desolation, which was placing the idol of Zeus in the temple of God and demanding worship, forbidding the worship of God by means of the law of Moses. They were all familiar with that. They were familiar with the book of Daniel. They were familiar with the fact that in the last chapter of Daniel, this incident is referred to as the abomination of desolation. And no doubt in their minds, when Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, their minds would immediately go to Antiochus Epiphanes and the whole story of Hanukkah, which they celebrate. In fact, Jesus himself celebrated Hanukkah along with his disciples in John chapter 10. It says that he was at the temple for the Feast of the Dedication, and it was winter. And the Feast of the Dedication was the rededication of the temple after that 3 years of the sacrifices being stopped. So the story of Hanukkah and all that was still fairly fresh in the minds of the Jews, because it had only occurred, it started in 168 BC approximately, and here we are only not even 200 years later when this story of Hanukkah had taken place. So by saying to them, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, I am sure that for the disciples it created some questions in their mind, because Jesus was telling them to look forward to an event that has happened already in the past. Isn't that right? That's what he was telling them. Now, how does that work? Well, Jesus didn't go on to explain how that works, but he just simply said, whoever reads, let him understand. Which means, or which implies to me, that at the time, the understanding will come to those who are genuinely seeking God's wisdom and the signs that were to be watched for in the end times. Now, let's go over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. There's really not a great deal about this subject in the New Testament other than Jesus' comments in the Olivet Discourse, and then the Apostle Paul, decades later, gives us another little glimpse at his understanding of what Jesus was talking about. All right, so let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. One of the things that, if you guys study Paul, particularly in both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which those two books deal a great deal with the end times and the second coming of Christ. But what the Apostle Paul does throughout his teaching on the last days is he is constantly borrowing terminology and themes from Jesus' discussion in his Olivet Discourse. All right, there are so many things that he borrows from it in both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians that it is quite clear that what he's doing is offering a commentary and applying what Jesus said to his disciples. He's now applying it to the churches generally and how they are to anticipate the coming of Christ. And so we get to chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians. Here's what the Apostle Paul says. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Now, this terminology, shaken in mind and troubled, the Greek terms have a reference to unwarranted excitement, all right? Either negatively or positively, all right? But it's being all worked up, all right? Not necessarily negatively. All right, so he's telling them, don't get all worked up as though, and it says here in this particular translation, as though the day of Christ had come in the past tense. All right, if you have a King James version, it says, as though the day of Christ is at hand. Now, what's the correct translation? It literally is a perfect tense verb, so it does refer to a past event. However, the verb refers to something becoming close at hand, that is standing next to. So literally what he's saying is not to be anxious or have anxiety as though the day of Christ has become close by, all right, or is immediately at hand. All right, it has all of a sudden now Christ's coming is imminent. It could be happening at any moment. All right, the Apostle Paul is saying that's not the case, and he doesn't want Christians to have that kind of a mentality, because there is a time when the coming of Christ will be at hand and imminent, because the fulfillment of the signs that Jesus gave are actually taking place, right? So he goes on to say, let no one deceive you by any means. And this is an interesting statement, because when Jesus, the very first thing out of Jesus' mouth when his disciples asked him what are going to be the signs of your coming and the end of the age, was almost the exact same statement. Don't let anyone deceive you. All right? And let me tell you something. There are plenty out there who will deceive you, because they have all kinds of false scenarios on how things are going to play out. Everything from, you've got nothing to worry about because Jesus is going to come and take everybody to heaven before anything bad happens, you know, to preterists, which say the second coming already happened a long time ago, and we're living in the kingdom now. I don't know about you, but that doesn't work for me. Anyway, so he says, not to let anyone deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. Now, what is this falling away? Well, if you go back and look at Jesus' statements in the Olivet Discourse, he said that many of his followers are going to hate one another and betray one another. Isn't that right? He talked about that, and he said those who endure to the end will be saved. So that's what that refers to. And then he says, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. And that's exactly what Jesus referred to in verse 15 of Matthew 24, when he said, when you see the abomination of desolation. Now, what's interesting now is that the Apostle Paul, beginning in verse 4, goes on to elaborate more on what the abomination of desolation looks like. And if you read what the Apostle Paul says, it fits perfectly with what Antiochus did 150 some years, 160 years before Christ. It says, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worship. That's exactly what Antiochus did. He took the name, the title, God Manifest. He claimed to be deity in the flesh. And he put the idol of Zeus, which he claimed was him, essentially, in the temple of God. So it says, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worship, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. He's exalting himself above the God of Israel and taking over God's temple and demanding to be worshipped. All of this is what Antiochus did. Do you not remember that when I was with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, only he who now restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way, and then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. Now, my question to you is, who is the one restraining here? Dave? Michael and his angels. I mean, we saw that in Daniel chapter 10, that Michael is specifically identified as one who is the chief person or being involved in this struggle between these demonic forces that are trying to control the empires and God's angels, which are restraining them. And what does Daniel 12:1 say? That at that time, that is when it says it's Antiochus attacks Egypt the second time, he says, at that time, Michael will stand up, and there will be this time of trouble like has never been in the past or ever will be in the future. Jesus was quoting that as well in Matthew chapter 24. He said virtually the same statement. Now look at verse 9. He says, the coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders. Now there is going to be some miraculous things that take place in the coming of this man. Well, I think resurrection would fit into that category. I don't know about you guys, right? And with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion, or a strong delusion. Now, does Satan have the power to raise the dead? Can God give him power to raise the dead on a particular instance so that this can play out? Yes, he can, yes.
I wonder why God would give him the power to do that.
Well, what does it say right here? We just read it.
Strong delusion.
For this reason, God will send them the strong delusion.
Yeah.
Why? That they might believe the lie. And it's got the definite article there. The lie is referring to a specific lie.
Yeah, there's giving the power of resurrection and the delusion seem like two different things. Actually giving him power to infuse life into dead persons. Doesn't seem like.
But the delusion is that this God who is raising this man is greater than the God of the Bible.
Yeah,
that's the delusion,
yeah.
Right? Because the Antichrist is not Christ, you know, a false Christ. The Antichrist is the alternative to Christ. He's not claiming, he doesn't go into the temple and claim to be Jesus Christ as the second coming. He claims to be God, right? That's a totally different thing. What is God? The supreme ruler. So what he's claiming is that this God that he's worshiping, that he's promoting, is superior to the God of the Bible, and he's going to prove it. Right?
Yeah, you know how
It says we did it too, because it says, because they did not receive the love of the truth, so the world brought it upon itself in the form of sin. God's allowing it as a form of judgment.
Not only is he allowing it, it says God is sending it.
Yeah.
God is sending this strong delusion. But he tells them why he's sending it. He doesn't send us. I mean, is God the author of lies and deception? No. But when people reject the truth, after they have rejected the truth, then God will give them what they really want, right? Which is the alternative to God, the alternative to his Son. That's what they want, because they like their sin and they like their ungodliness, and they want to have that as well as the things that are going to be promised to them by this false God, who is Satan himself. So it says, for this reason God will send them strong delusion, and they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Well, it's a pretty powerful passage of Scripture there, isn't it? Well, let's go to Revelation chapter 13. What is the central feature of the gospel?
The coming kingdom.
That's a significant part of it, but what is it that sets apart the gospel of Christ from any other message? What is it that the apostles preached constantly? It was the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Isn't that right? That was the proof. The proof of the truth of the gospel. It was the proof for us that the promises of immortality that God has made to Abraham and his seed, that those promises will in fact be fulfilled, and Christ's resurrection was a demonstration of that, right? Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection, according to the Apostle Paul. We get to Revelation chapter 13. We are introduced to this beast. Let's look at verse 1. Then I stood on the sand of the sea. You know, it's interesting, Daniel's visions, in Daniel 7 and in other places, he sees these beasts coming up out of the sea, or the Great Sea, which was the Mediterranean Sea. And this seems to be the place where all this activity takes place, right? I mean, that's the way it was in Daniel, and we see the same thing here. So I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and his great authority. Now what we see in verse 2 is some of the characteristics of some of the animals in Daniel's visions. Isn't that right? We've got the leopard, we've got the bear, we've got some of these more violent traits or characteristics from some of the others, and we see that they're all on this big beast that's coming up. But why does this beast now, it's different from any of the beasts in Daniel, because it has 7 heads. None of the beasts in Daniel had multiple heads, except, well, I'll take that back, the leopard had 4, right? And what did the 4 heads on the leopard show? The 4 divisions of Alexander's kingdom, right? Why does this beast have 7 heads? And in that way, it's different from any of the other allegories, if you will, of the kingdoms and whatnot that we see in the book of Daniel. Why do you think this beast has 7 heads? Let's start with that question. Yes, Tim.
Maybe it has a lion's head, a bear's head, 4 leopards' head, and a terrible beast head, which makes 7.
Okay. Anybody else want to take a guess? Yeah.
7 spirits.
What does that mean?
I guess. It's a mashup beast. I mean, I'm seriously suggesting that it's those other beasts.
Those other kingdoms?
Yeah, it's a manifestation of that.
So the Persians, the Babylonians, and all that. Okay, let's go. All right, yeah, you got to. I think you're getting pretty close to the right answer, but let's look at Tim's comment first. Let's go back to chapter 12. Verse 1. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. And being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was there found place for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon, this is the 7-headed dragon, was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast out, cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Now, the point I want to make is that before we're introduced to the beast in chapter 13, who has 7 heads, we're introduced to Satan as having the 7 heads and the 10 horns, right? Now, if your theory is true, and I entertained that idea for a while as well, that would mean essentially that these the Babylonian kingdom, the Persians, the Greeks, all these different kingdoms that we saw in Daniel were satanic in some way, because Satan is the one. Now, what was the purpose of Satan here? This beast with 7 heads, who's Satan, what was his purpose in this passage? To overthrow the Son of God. Isn't that right? His purpose was to overthrow the Son of God. It's got the allegory of the woman giving birth and the child who's going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Well, that statement comes directly out of Psalm chapter 2, where God says of his Son, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you, ask of me, and I'll give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You will rule them with a rod of iron." Right? That's where that comes from. Yes, Levi. Yes, it does. No, I don't think this, I mean, there are many more than 7 nations. I mean, there have been many, many kingdoms all down through the centuries.
I think the idea is, like, God has clearly used his own singular-headed beast. If it was a nation, it would be Israel. Like, everything, he's used this nation to accomplish his purpose, right? And Satan is using the other nations that are around. Like, all these nations, they have something to do with Israel. That's why
the ones that are mentioned, yes.
Right, that's why there's not an America in the...
Right, because it's all centered in Israel.
Yeah, so these beasts are just things, these are all representative of the nations that primarily have been used to be on the other side of it. Like,
but the problem with that theory is that the kingdom of Persia was always favorable to Israel. From the very beginning, when Cyrus defeated Nebuchadnezzar, and God said that he was his anointed one, and he was going to send Israel back and rebuild, and he paid for a great deal of the rebuilding of the temple and all that. And the Persians really, I mean, other than some just little minor things in delays in the temple reconstruction, the Persians were actually very favorable to Israel. Alexander the Great didn't bother Israel with his kingdom, not until it was divided up, and then you got Antiochus and all that stuff going on. Do we find this opposition to that?
I just mean it's not just about whether they're enemies of Israel, because Persia right now is an enemy of Israel. They're not helping Israel. They say death to Israel. But even the Egyptians, who were enemies of Israel, that was a place where Israel was nurtured. And when they got sent out, they plundered the Egyptians in their going out. So
Do you think the Egyptians are one of the heads?
What's that?
Do you think the Egyptians?
No, I'm just saying the nations around there, it's not just exclusively that they persecute the Jews in some way. It's about God ultimately using these nations like Pharaoh, who hardened his heart. He raised up Pharaoh because Pharaoh's the right kind of guy to do this work.
I agree with you that God has used a lot of nations in order to do his work, but we're talking about the heads on Satan himself. We're talking about kingdoms, and as we'll see, we get to chapter 17, it specifically says that the 7 heads are 7 kings. All right. Now, in my opinion, and again, a lot of this is speculation. All right, so just like you're speculating, I'm going to speculate as well. I believe that Satan has had 7 antichrists down through history. And if you think about it, can you think of any kingdoms? I mean, going back to the book of Genesis, can you think of any kingdoms that were anti-Christ, anti-God, that were set up directly as an affront to God and his plan? Okay, somebody said Nimrod. Okay, Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. Remember that story? Nimrod, he brought in all this paganism. He basically became a god himself. I see Adam's over there laughing because there's a running gag joke in their family about being a Nimrod. Well, anyway, I believe Satan has attempted down through history to take over basically the world and seize it away from God. And that one of those instances was the Tower of Babel, and what did God do? He came down and foiled it all, right? There have been other instances as well. If you read in the book of Ezekiel, there are prophecies about this guy named the king of Tyre. Now, Tyre was a nation on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, going way back in Old Testament times. In fact, it was Hiram, the king of Tyre, who originally provided the wood, the cypress wood and so forth, to build Solomon's temple. And he was friends with Solomon, and there was a good relationship between Tyre and King Solomon, until after that king passed off the scene, and then a very wicked and vile king took his place. And then God's prophets pronounced judgments upon some of these ancient kingdoms, and Tyre was one of those. And one of the amazing things about the prophecy in Ezekiel against the king of Tyre is Ezekiel talks about some of the things he did, but then he says, you were in the Garden of Eden. And when you were in the Garden of Eden, you were more beautiful than all these other creatures. And he talks about the worshiping of God in the Garden of Eden. And then he says, until wickedness was found in you. And we know who it was who was in the Garden of Eden, who wickedness was found in him, who deceived Eve into partaking of the tree, right? That was this same dragon that's in Revelation chapter 12, who has 7 heads and 10 horns. See, I think that was Satan's first attempt, right there in the Garden of Eden. And then, I mean, how else can he be talking about this king of Tyre as being in Eden unless there is the same demonic entity who is Satan himself, who has moved from the Garden of Eden and trying to overthrow God in the Garden of Eden, to then moving maybe to the Tower of Babel and trying to overthrow God in the Tower of Babel, and then moving to Tyre, and then moving to these other places where these kingdoms have been set up, which in most cases started out just fine, and then they became extraordinarily apostate, and then these demonic men basically took charge of those kingdoms. I'm not going to try to speculate on all 7 and what they were, okay? But I disagree, and I used to hold the view you hold now, but I don't believe it's talking necessarily about the same kingdoms that we saw in Daniel. I think because if it was only 7 heads on the beast in chapter 13, I might tend to agree. But because these 7 heads are first introduced to us on Satan himself, who is the one who wants to usurp God's rule and take God's place. And if you look at Satan's history, not just world history or Middle Eastern history. If you look at Satan's history, in his attempts to seize the world for himself and to take it away from God and to completely overthrow God, he has had a history of doing that. And in my opinion, the last head is, well, actually, let's go over to chapter 17 for just a moment.
It also
Yeah.
connects, in chapter 2, it connects the pagan temple in Pergamon to Satan's throne. That's him sitting himself there with that Antichrist.
Yep.
A lot of that.
Yes, yes. Chapter 17 of, and I'm not going to get all into this because later I'm going to be teaching through the book of Revelation, and I'm going to try to deal with these beasts and this topic in a lot more detail. I'm just trying to just throw out this idea for you to kind of percolate on a little bit, that this Antichrist is not the first Antichrist. All right, there have been a series of 7. Yes.
In 13, 3, it says that, and I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his death was all beasts. Would you say that supports the Antichrist in that?
It could support it. I think it does, but I mean, there are other ways of explaining it. There are some people who say that, when the Antichrist comes, he's going to be assassinated and then raised from the dead immediately, and that kind of thing. I think he's already been assassinated by God a long time ago.
So would that also
But
say support the fact that all the heads are Antichrist throughout time?
how would it support that? I'm not sure.
It says that one of the heads on the beast
Mhm. Yeah, I believe they are, but I don't know that you could prove it from that. Okay. Anyway, let's go to chapter 17 for just a moment. Verse 9. Here is the mind which has wisdom. By the way, he introduces a beast again in chapter 17 with a woman riding on this beast. And this beast has 7 heads again and 10 horns. All right. We won't get into the woman. That's a topic for another class. But I want to point out what he says about the 7 heads again here. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and a mountain in biblical prophecy, kingdoms were often referred to as a mountain. All right, in many of the prophets, it was very common. So he says, here's a mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and there are also 7 kings. All right, he's interpreting the 7 heads. He doesn't say 7 kingdoms, he says 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast which was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7. That's interesting, isn't it? So there are 7 heads, which are 7 kings. But the Antichrist, who's to come, is the 8th, but yet he is of the 7, which implies it's the second coming of one of the 7. All right, you see that? All right, again, I don't want to get too deep into chapter 17. Now, how did Antiochus die? We talked about this a little bit before. How did Antiochus die? Did he die of natural causes? Did he die in battle? This is what the book of 2nd Maccabees. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the books of the Maccabees. They're not in our Bible. They're part of what is referred to as the Apocrypha. They are Jewish historical books that were written back around the time of these events, but they're not considered to be inspired by God. They're just considered to be an accurate historical record of the Jews at the time. Okay, so they're useful to us for their historical value, but we don't place any prophetic, inspired kind of weight on them as being, without error or anything like that. But they are the perspective of the Jews at the time in telling the story of what happened during that period of time. And so the 1st, 2nd Maccabees covers Antiochus, the whole story of Antiochus Epiphanes, right? His sacking the temple and all that he did, all right? Anyway, in 2 Maccabees chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, it says, transported with rage, he conceived the idea of turning upon the Jews the injury done by those who had put him to flight. And he's here talking about how the Romans headed off his advance into Egypt, gave him the ultimatum and all that. And so he turned around, he's heading back through Judea. It says, so he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until he completed the journey. But the judgment of heaven rode with, no, I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong historical reference. This was after the incident of him defiling the temple, and this is when he received word that the Jews, the Maccabees, had defeated his army and had taken his idol out of the temple and were cleansing the temple and so forth. Anyway, but he's off fighting another battle, and he gets word of that. That's what this is. All right, let me start over again. Transported with rage, he conceived the idea of turning upon the Jews with the injury done by those who had put him to flight. So he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until he completed the journey. But the judgment of heaven rode with him. For in his arrogance he said, when I get there, I will make Jerusalem a cemetery of Jews. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and invisible blow. As soon as he stopped speaking, he was seized with pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with the sharp internal tortures. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms, and while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotting away, and because of the stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. Because of his intolerable stench, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before had thought that he would touch the stars of heaven. That's how the Jews described his death, as being struck down by God. Now, in Revelation chapter 13, it talks about him receiving a deadly wound, and it says that he was wounded by the sword. And so a lot of people might say, well, Antiochus was not killed in battle, and therefore, it couldn't be talking about Antiochus. But the fact is, it doesn't say that the Antichrist is wounded by the sword. It says that one of the heads of the creature, the beast, was wounded by the sword. Now, does God have a sword, and is that the kind of terminology that we see used in the prophets for this kind of striking down of a king? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. I want to show you that in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Go over there for just a moment. We'll read verses 9 through 12. Then the Lord spoke to Gad, David's seer, saying, go tell David, my servant, thus says the Lord, I offer you three things. Now this, by the way, is when David, against God's command, David decided to number his army. God didn't want him to number his army. God wanted him to trust in him when he went into battle, even if he was greatly outnumbered by the enemy. But David rebelled against God, and he decided to count up his army so that he could see if he could defeat the enemies that God said he was going to turn into his hands. And God was very angry with David for doing that. So he says, the Lord God spoke to David's seer, saying, go tell David, saying, thus says the Lord, I offer you three things. Choose one of them for yourself, that I may do it to you. So he's given David his choice of punishments. So Gad came to David and said to him, thus says the Lord, choose for yourself either 3 years of famine, or 3 months to be defeated by your foes with the sword of your enemies overtaking you, or else 3 days of the sword of the Lord. And here's what the sword of the Lord was: the plague in the land, with the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel. Now consider what answer I should take back to him who sent me. And David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Please let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are very great. But do not let me fall into the hand of men. So the Lord sent a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. And God sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. And he was destroying, as he was destroying, the Lord looked and relented of the disaster, and said to the angel who was destroying, "It is enough. Restrain your hand." And the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Onan the Jebusite. Then David lifted up his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven, having his hand, a drawn sword, stretched out over Jerusalem. So David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell on their faces and so forth. So we see a plague. God sent a plague, which was like a disease, upon Israel in response to David's disobedience. But even a plague is referred to as the Lord's sword of judgment striking down his people. Go to 2 Chronicles, just a little bit to the right there, chapter 21. And verse 11. Moreover, he made high places in the mountains of Judah and caused the inhabitants of Jerusalem to commit harlotry and led Judah astray. This is the king of Judah. And a letter came to him from Elijah the prophet. Now, by the way, this was approximately 14 years after Elijah was caught up into heaven in the fiery chariot. Okay? If you do the chronology, it's about that, about 14 years. But here's this wicked king who came to power after Elijah had gone, and he gets a letter from Elijah. Now, obviously, Elijah did not send it by fiery chariot to the king. Elijah was still somewhere on earth. He was just caught to another location. But anyway, that's a little trivia for him. Here's the letter. Thus says the Lord God of your father David, because you have not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father, or in the ways of Asa king of Judah, but have walked in the way of the kings of Israel, and have made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to play the harlot like the harlotry of the house of Ahab, and have also killed your brothers, those of your father's household who were better than yourself. Behold, the Lord will strike your people with a serious affliction, your children, your wives, and all your possessions. And you will become very sick with a disease in your intestines, until your intestines come out by reason of the sickness day by day. Now, that was the letter, and if you continue reading in this chapter, that's exactly what God did as his judgment upon this king of Israel, is he smote him with this very same kind of sickness, where his gut basically came out, and he died in agony, very similar to what God did to Antiochus Epiphanes, which the Jews referred to as God smiting him down. Now, with a little bit of time that I have left, I want to talk with you about the number 666 and what that means. Let's go to Revelation chapter 13. What I'm going to tell you is only a suggestion. It's something, it's food for thought. It's something I want you to consider as an alternate explanation for the typical, the way that most people look at the mark of the beast and the number of his name in Revelation chapter 13. In the last verse in Revelation 13, it says, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate or count," depending on your version, "the number of the beast. For it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, what's interesting about this verse is if you look at the Greek text, it says it is, present tense, the number of a man. And it uses the verb of being, present tense verb of being here. Now, from John's perspective, he says it is the number of a man. The natural reading would imply, let's put it that way, that this was a man that was known to John. All right, a man that either existed at the time or had existed, and there was a record of him existing, rather than it is the number of someone who has not existed yet, someone who is, you know, not born yet, somebody who is off in the future, a name that, you know, perhaps they're not familiar with, all right? And you guys know that most expositors of Revelation will say that, well, you know, the Greek language did not have numbers like we have, all right? We have letters, we have an alphabet, and our alphabet doesn't have any numerical value at all, right? We have different characters that we use. We use Arabic numerals, basically, to count with. We don't count with our alphabet letters. Well, the Hebrew language and the Greek language didn't have that. They actually just counted, and the Latins as well. They simply assigned numerical values to the letters of their alphabets. All right. Now, the Hebrews and the Greeks had the same process, which was you started at alpha, you start at the beginning, or aleph if it's Hebrew, and you count the letters of your alphabet, and their value is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. When you get to the 10th letter, it has a value of 10. All right? Then after 10, it counts by tens. So the next letter would be 20, then 30, then 40, then 50, then 60, 70, 80, 90, and then 100. And then from there, it counts by hundreds. 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, all the way up to 800 in the Greek alphabet. The Hebrew has fewer letters. All right, now, that was the way that the ancients used numbers. All right, they just used letters. They used series of letters. The oldest manuscripts, some of the Greek manuscripts of the Bible actually have the 3 letters. The first letter that would represent 600, the next letter that would represent 60, and the last letter that represented 6, okay? And, you know, the manuscripts that the King James Version was translated from, and most of our English Bibles were translated from, those manuscripts just simply had those 3 letters. And because of that, for that reason, a lot of Bible expositors believe that it was, if you want to know the name of the Antichrist, you have to use this numbering system whereby you give, you know, the letters their numerical value, and you add them all up together, and it's supposed to come out to 666. All right. But the fact is, the oldest manuscripts of Revelation, it's actually just spelled out. It doesn't use the individual letters. It spells out 660 and 6. Okay. So the oldest manuscripts do not imply in any way that you know, that this is to be calculated by numerical values. It's simply saying that the number of this man, or the number associated with this man, has a value of 660 and 6. Now, where does this idea of finding mystical meanings by adding up numbers of letters in certain words and all that kind of stuff, where does that come from?
Numerology.
Numerology. Who was it that used numerology? Well, what it was the mystery, the pagan mystery religions, all right? They thought that there was always some hidden meaning, you know, in documents and so forth, and that you could, you know, it's like the Bible code stuff. You guys have heard about the Bible codes, right? Where they're supposed to be able to discern secret messages out of the Bible by numerology, all right? But the pagans were the ones who did that, for the most part. And Gnosticism, you guys are familiar with Gnosticism, the Gnostics did that a lot. Because for them, the surface meaning was just, you know, that was for us, the stupid people. The real meaning was in this mystical stuff below the surface, you know, and you had to have secret codes and, I don't know, Ouija boards or something to discern the secret messages in the Bible. And that was what Gnosticism was based on. And unfortunately, I think Christians have been led to believe, and I believed this for many years, and only until recently have I begun to even question it, that maybe the number of the beast, or his name, is being given to us in the Bible without using that kind of mystical numerology. I mean, after all, why would God, there's nowhere else in the Bible, by the way, where numerology is actually used. You don't see it in the Old Testament, you don't see it in the New Testament. Why would God all of a sudden, in the book of Revelation, use a pagan methodology that was used by the Gnostics and all the pagans in order to give his people a clue to what the Antichrist's name would be in the end times so that we could avoid him. But unfortunately, because those ancient languages are long gone, you have to be some kind of a linguistic scholar with regard to ancient languages in order to be able to come up with the name of the Antichrist. Now, doesn't that seem a little bit too obscure for the God of Israel, who seems to give us all this information ahead of time, and now we've got to go diving into that kind of stuff in order to try to add up people's names, and we don't even know what language to use. Should it be Greek because Revelation was written in Greek, or should it be Hebrew, or should it be Arabic, or should it be, I don't know, what, something else, right? I mean, to me, that just seems a little bit too far-fetched from the patterns of revelation that we see given in the Bible. And you know, one of the things that I harped on a lot when I taught through the book of Revelation a few years ago was how much of the book of Revelation is rooted in the Old Testament. That you can hardly get a few verses in Revelation without direct either quotes or allusions to Old Testament prophecy. It is everywhere in the book of Revelation, right? And he's constantly drawing on patterns from the Old Testament. So I'm going to give you a possible alternate explanation for the number 666 that to me seems more consistent with the way, the manner in which God has revealed things in the past. And that is, he doesn't send us out to find some hidden truth in the depths of the sea. You know, just like he said through Moses, you know, don't say that, you know, it's beyond the sea, who should come and bring it to us? Or it's up in heaven, who's going to go up and bring it down to us that we may know it and obey it, right? He says it's right in front of your noses. All right? So, let's look at what it says very carefully. Here is wisdom, let him who has understanding calculate or count, that's all the word means, the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, if we were going to follow the pattern that we follow throughout all the rest of Scripture, where would we look for that? Maybe the Old Testament? Is there anybody in the Old Testament who had the number 666? Yes, there is. There's a man. Let's go to Ezra chapter 2, or you can read it on the screen. At the time of the return from the Babylonian exile, the book of Ezra gives us the names of various families that were taken into the exile, who survived the exile, and who came back, and the number of persons that came back with them. Ezra 2, verse 1, and then I'll read verse 13. Now these are the people of the province who came back from the captivity of those who had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away to Babylon, and who returned to Jerusalem and Judah, everyone to his own city. And then it gives a list of the people, and then the number of their family who returned with them. The people of Adonikam, 666. Now, that seems like just a piece of trivia that has absolutely nothing to do with the end times, until you analyze what the name means, Adonikam. It's a very interesting name. It's basically the same word as Adonai. You all familiar with the Hebrew word Adonai, right? Which is a title for God. But it's actually Adon. The letter I, which is Yod in Hebrew, is a suffix. And when that suffix is used, it makes it a possessive, or it has the meaning of it's like if you're going to say God of something, God of Israel, you would use Adonai. You would add the letter I, the Hebrew letter Yod. Okay, it wouldn't just be Adon, which is Lord or God, but it would be Adonai, which means God of. All right. The same suffix also can mean my God. If I say my God, I would say Adonai. All right, so it's the context that tells us which of those two meanings Adonai has. Adonikam is Adonai plus a verb, kam, which in Hebrew means to arise from the dead. It's used of resurrection several times in the scriptures. For example, if you go to Isaiah chapter, I believe it's 28. I could be wrong on that, I didn't write it down.
26
Is it 26? Thank you. Verse 19. Isaiah is talking about the resurrection. He says, your dead shall live. Together with my dead body they shall arise. And that is the Hebrew word there, kam. You can see he's talking about the resurrection. Now, it doesn't always refer to the resurrection. It can refer to just getting up from sleep as well. All right, but it does refer to the resurrection on plenty of occasions. So, what does this name, Adonikam, mean then? It literally means either one of two things. It can either be translated, my arisen Lord, or my arisen God, or Lord of arising. Either way. All right, depending on whether the yod is a possessive or not. Now, what do you think, if a person takes the mark of the beast, which is the name of the beast, or the number of his name, and if this idea that Antiochus is coming back, he's going to be resurrected again, and if he kills the two witnesses, which he will do according to Revelation chapter 11, one of which is Elijah the prophet, who has arisen from the dead in order to carry out his function in the last days. And you have this guy claiming to be the replacement for Christ instead of Christ, who was raised from the dead after only 3 days. I mean, that's a miracle, but hey, I mean, how about after, 2,000 years, right? And then two other guys are raised from the dead, the two prophets, and they prophesy, and then this guy comes and he kills the others who have risen from the dead. And he can prove that he has risen from the dead. His resurrection is proven superior to the resurrections that God has brought about. Wouldn't this name be absolutely appropriate for a guy like that? Lord of Rising, or my arisen Lord, if you take his mark or his name. I just thought that was quite a coincidence. All right, and you can take it for that if you want to. If you want to start, keep adding up people's numbers of their names and try to figure out who the name of the Antichrist is, feel free to do that. But I think it's very possible that God has given us the answer all along. And did you know that this name, by the way, Adonikam, is a name that's used by people today? I went online and did a search, and there are people who have that as their last name, and there are people who have it as their first name that are out there, all right? So, all right, so it's not unusual. I mean, it might be rare, but it's not impossible that a person could go by that name, even today. All right, so yes.
The name Antiochus Epiphanes, wasn't that a title? Was that a title that was given?
Yes.
Okay, so what was his real name?
His birth name was Mithridates, which literally means gift of Mithra. Mithra was the Persian deity, and that was what he was named as a baby, was Mithridates. But when he was a young man, he actually was, because the Romans were basically invading, taking territory away from the Seleucid Empire. He actually was taken hostage by the Romans as a young man, and he was kept in Rome as a hostage until his father died, and then he, through some finagling, making friends with the right people, he ended up seizing the kingdom. He was released from his, being hostage in Rome, and he took over the kingdom, and he changed his name to Antiochus, which was the name of his father. But then after he, was in his kingdom a little while, he then added the title, the Manifest God, as part of his title as well. Also, all of those were assumed names. Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. It was in Greek. Yeah. Mithridates was the Greek spelling and Greek pronunciation of the name of the Persian deity. All right. Anybody else? Yeah. Okay.
I'm curious, is Antiochus more well known over there than here? Because here, unless you know the story of Hanukkah, most Americans don't really know who he is. But do they, like Israel, Indians know who he is? Is he well known?
Well, for those who study world history, he's just as well known as Alexander the Great, or Cyrus the Great, or Nebuchadnezzar, or any of those people. He's very, very famous for what he did. So he's not like some obscure character. He's very, very, very well known. Of course, he's much more well known among the Jews than among the average Americans, because they know the story of Hanukkah. But yeah, did you have a question? Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if you guys are aware of this or not, but he was, his title, Epiphanes, that he named himself, his people, some of his subjects, considered him to be insane. And they nicknamed him Epimanes, which was a play on his title Epiphanes, and Epimanes means madman. So he was very his manner of ruling was very odd, and he did weird things like dress up in different costumes and go out among the people and pretend to be other people, and weird things like that. He was a little bit insane, you might say. Not the typical thing that a normal ruler who was trying to get respect and claiming to be God in the flesh would do, but like Obama, God in the flesh. No, I'm just kidding. Bad joke. Oh.
So
I'll cut that out of the tape.
So Obama's one of the seven. That's what we keep
No, I think Obama's just another pawn. I don't think he's a bishop or a knight. Just a pawn. Anyway, yeah. Excuse me? Yes, I think so. It's gonna, in order for this to play out the way I'm suggesting it plays out, there's going to have to be some ironclad proof, right? Because people aren't going to believe it, so there's going to have to be some proof. Yeah.
When I first heard you say about the resurrection of Antiochus, I immediately thought back to the story that I heard in 2003. BBC News reported that they had found the tomb of Gilgamesh, which some people have connected to Nimrod, and then you were talking about demonic type of activity. And I thought of DNA tampering and how they cloned Dolly and they're doing all this stuff with genes, and I just thought that was in 2003, and I always thought that the Antichrist would be the same age as Jesus Christ during his ministry, and I thought that would be 33 years later, like if there was some sort of gene manipulation. So I don't know if it's DNA from this Gilgamesh preserved body and genes would be playing out. But anyway, that's what I thought of.
Yeah.
Speculation, resurrection,
Yeah.
tampering, I don't know.
Yeah. For me, in order for this to actually play out the way I think it's going to play out, as I'm suggesting, it would have to be the same man, not a clone, not anything like that. It would have to be a genuine resurrection, not some duplicate, because of the language in Daniel 11 and Daniel 8, where it's clearly the same man that's being talked about doing these different things. in ancient times and then in the end times. So, you know, and I mean, look at his story. It was when he found out that the Jews had defeated his army that he had placed in Judea, that the Maccabees had overthrown his army, that he turned his chariot around and he was headed back for Israel, and he said he was going to turn Jerusalem into a graveyard of God's people. And it was at that moment that God struck him down. You know, and you can picture him coming back and picking up right where he left off. And it's fitting perfectly with the scenario that we see given to us in the book of Revelation. You know, so doesn't seem as far-fetched, I think. Yes. Well, I'm not saying, again, this is only, I'm throwing this out as a possibility, as an alternate way that maybe God has put the name right in front of us the whole time. You know, so I'm not saying that's definitely that way, but it seems to me to be more consistent with the way God has revealed things in the past, if we follow his patterns. So rather than using this mystical stuff. So anyway, somebody else? Yeah.
Do you think his resurrection is going to be supernatural or some magical mystery like that miracle that shows the power?
I think it's going to show the power of Satan. And it's power that Satan will be allowed by God to possess temporarily for the purpose of deceiving the whole world. I mean, if you look at 2 Thessalonians 2, I think it's pretty clear that God sends this. God allows this to happen. I don't think Satan has the power to raise the dead on his own, but I think God is going to give him that power for this very purpose. And I think that's consistent with what 2 Thessalonians says. What I'm trying to do is look at all these variables that we have in Matthew and Thessalonians and in Revelation and Daniel, and look at all these variables and try to find a scenario that answers all the problems. One scenario that solves all the problems, even as bizarre as it might seem on the surface. In my opinion, it solves all the difficulties that are there, including the 2,300 days, the fact of, you know, the same guy talked about both back then and in the future, all these different things, the use of the same terminology in different places and all that. So again, I'm putting this out here for your consideration, as I'm not predicting that this is how it's going to play out. I'm simply saying that with this scenario, as bizarre as you might think it is, in my opinion, it has answered all of the problems that seem to be present in the text with just one very simple scenario. And to me, in the past, I have had to rethink a lot of things that I've been taught. But after a while, you get a nose for you're onto something, right? And it's always the same for me, and it's been the same in all the different doctrinal shifts that I have gone through. And that is, one little idea, all of a sudden, all these other passages that seem to be problematic fall into place, and the problems disappear. And it doesn't create a lot of new problems. Because that's another thing I've noticed. You know, if you're onto something, you think you might be on the right thing, but it might solve a problem over here, but now it's creating more problems over here. To me, that says, you know what? I'm on the wrong path. Because the truth is always found when everything comes together in harmony, right? That's when you know you're onto the truth. And so I think, you know, I've developed a little bit of a nose for that as I've been working my way studying the scriptures over the last 35 years. And this is one of those things that, you know, again, as far-fetched, if you told me this, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, that you'd be standing up here and saying that, you know, the Antichrist is Antiochus Epiphanes, I would have said, you're a moron. You're an idiot. But I would have said the same thing about, you know, that I would have, you know, changed my views on the Trinity, or that I would have changed my views on the immortality of the soul, or any of those other things that I've changed my positions on over the years. So, you know, I'm trying to just go where I think the evidence leads, and where Scripture seems to begin to, the problems begin to evaporate and disappear, and I see things, you know. And you know, when I look out at the world situation right now, the things, the direction that I seem to be going in my understanding of Bible prophecy seems to be, the changes that are taking place out there right now seem to be falling right into line with what think I'm seeing as well. I mean, you guys, last year during the retreat is when the Supreme Court of the United States made gay marriage legal. It was on the last day of the retreat last year. And isn't it funny this year, not that we're anything special, just a coincidence I'm sure, but here we are during this retreat. Yesterday, Britain voted to leave the European Union. I don't know if you guys are aware that the vote was yesterday, and everybody was predicting that the polls were saying they were going to stay, right? Guess what? They're not staying. They left. They're leaving the EU. Cameron is going to resign. We don't know who's going to fill the power vacuum. But the EU is, I'm telling you right now, you mark my words, the EU is going to be crumbling and falling apart. And in its place, there are going to be 10 powerful leaders that arise. All right? And they're coming, and it's not going to be that long. We don't have a lot of time left. All right, so you watch, those 10 kings are going to start showing up on the scene, coming out of Europe.